as Avarignian fishermen beheld that enigmatic ship, grand and splendorous in ways beyond the imagining of even the finest Roman shipwright, they were beholding the culmination of over 1,400 years of history which had as yet been obscured to them. Indeed, before one can understand the nature of that mysterious vessel, we must first recount a brief history of the East and their omnipotent god. Over 1,400 years ago, in 35 AD, Asia was relatively stable, regional politics revolving around the well of power that was the Eastern Han during that period. To their north, the Xiongnu regularly harassed them, while all other polities were comparatively underdeveloped, such as the minor kingdoms of Korea and Japan. These minor powers paid tribute to the Han, who responded in kind with gifts of bronze bells or polished mirrors in order to provide legitimacy to local leaders. Their one contact to the outside world was through the Magadha Empire, which functioned as a hub through which many of their goods traveled. It was in this context that the 12 disciples of Yeshua arrived in Asia, spreading the great word first along the path of their travels in places like the Magadha Empire. Much of their early ministry in this regard is shrouded in mystery, and indeed history is left with the legendary account of their endeavors. It is said that one of the disciples, Thomas, remained in India and began a burgeoning ministry in the north of the country. Thomas was said to have healed the local governor's daughter, returning her sight, both of them converting forthwith. However, as the movement was gaining traction, he was martyred by a political rival of that governor, sentenced to death for crimes against the gods, and stabbed to death with spears. At this, the other disciples mourned his passing and fled the Magadha Empire. But Thomas left behind many believers, who, without any direction or correction from the church fathers, pontificated on this new theology in a vacuum, overstating the importance of John the Baptist and venerating him even over and above Yeshua, becoming the Mandeans. The other apostles continued onwards into Han territory, where they then dispersed. 5 of them, Bartholomew, Matthew, Simon, Jude, and James the Young, decided to forego proper civilization and preach to the forgotten, those beyond the walls of the cities who lived in the vast steppe and depended upon their horses for survival. These people were in some cases friendly, but most cases hostile. This ministry grew under the noses of the Xiongnu, who sought the destruction of these subversive cultists, performing many miracles in the name of their resurrected god. One famous such miracle was the doubling of the horses by Matthew. Approaching a large village whose horses had been decimated by disease and starvation, they were on the brink of death themselves as winter grew more severe. Matthew told them to walk the surviving horses through a yurt while him and the other disciples prayed over it. Legend goes that 13 horses went in and 26 went out. This happened 3 more times until the village and their future had been secured, and everyone there was baptized in a small pool of melted snow. The Xiongnu would eventually succeed in martyring all 5 of these holy men, stoning each of them to death. Regardless, they sowed the seeds of several churches and were present for long enough that they did not turn to heresy. Finally, the last 6 disciples dispersed throughout the Han Empire, Matthias going north, James the Greater going to the south, Peter staying in the west, Andrew ministering to the small villages, Philip to the large cities, and John to the imperial capital of the Han itself, Chang'an. Tradition continues that, as the other disciples spread the great word and performed miracles, John sat beneath a plum blossom tree and preached publicly to any who would listen, in their own tongue. Mystified at this bearded barbarian, many gathered and spoke with him, while others were healed, and still some pelted him with stones. It did not take long for him to gain the attention of Emperor Guangwu, who apprehended him and brought him to his court. Guangwu and his astrologers discussed many things with John, and while the astrologers were pleased and in their hearts convinced of Yeshua's divinity, Emperor Guangwu was not. The moment John called him a sinner, as all have sinned, he ordered John imprisoned. After several days, 5 of the astrologers came to free him, and indeed he fled, though they were soon caught and martyred for their faith. John continued to work in Chang'an, eventually ministering to soldiers and by word of mouth catching the ear of a high-ranking general, Chao Ban. Chao, taken in by his words, converted and was baptized, saying, "The blood of many men weighs heavy on me, but the blood of one man can make me clean." It was from here that the ministry took on a life of its own, and many things occurred between 35 and 65 AD. First, the Great Winter which ruined the West began to obscure the sun, and made life difficult here as it had for the entire world. This instability led to the collapse of the Xiongnu, as they were overcome by a separate group of horse nomads known as the Mongols, and these Mongols had accepted the message of the northern disciples. They began to increase their aggression against Emperor Guangwu, raiding harshly and often. The Christians of the north were at this time in communion with the Christians in the Han Empire, and a sprawling network of churches worked together and shared information, compiling the Shengjing, meaning sacred book. The emperor doubled down on his persecution of all Christians, denigrating their movement as Zhuelu, or the Way of Blood, mocking their criminal god, but they adopted this term fondly. Still, many clung to a transliteration of the Greek term used by the Phrygians, which the apostles preferred, Christianity. This would lead to its mixed use throughout history, Zhuelu being used within China while Christianity would be used without. Meanwhile, the persecutions of the emperor would have likely succeeded were it not for the meager son of that age. As the emperor struggled to feed his army, let alone his people, the entire administrative apparatus of the Han Empire began to buckle. Seeing these signs from the inside, General Chao Ban raised his flag in rebellion against Emperor Guangwu in the name of Yeshua, the Anointed One, the Shu Gaoja. This rebellion in 55 AD caused all to lose faith in the emperor, as non-Christian generals also carved out their own territories in attempts to preserve their own resources, and ultimately survive the age. This would be called the Posuida, or the Shattering. During this fighting, which engulfed Asia, John would serve as the spiritual advisor of Chao Ban, now known as King Shao, of the Kingdom of Shaojin. Peter traveled to the capital of Shaojin, the city of Suzhou, and established that place to be the seat of the church. He would eventually depart again, being martyred by a detachment of soldiers from neighboring Tongren, who beheaded anybody they caught along the road from Shaojin to their territory. The other disciples would all become martyrs in various ways as a result of the chaos, and John would pen the Book of Revelation in service to Chao Ban before his death of old age. By 100 AD, Asia had entered fully into its time of chaos, much the same as the West had. Food was scarce, wars were constant, and nothing was certain. Save, that is, for the spread of the Great Word. In the 1st century, only Shaojin and Mongolia were Christian, but by the 5th century, as they both grew in power and influence along with their unified church, nearly all of what was once China bowed beneath the banner of the Holy Mother Church, albeit beneath separate kings. Things like this continued until the 9th century, as the sun gave forth its light again, and life became more worth living. Various theological councils were called to determine the nature of the church, as well as the nature of Christ and what exactly it means to be Christian. A series of major disagreements ensued, like whether the Holy Spirit proceeds from the Father and the Son, or just the Father, whether the head of the church should be the first among equals in a council of bishops, or if the head in Suzhou holds supreme authority, and even if one should cross himself from right to left or left to right. Ultimately, these disagreements would fester for 100 years, until war broke out in the 9th century, resulting in a schism between the Zofstanal Church of the North and the Yuzhou Church of the South, translated as Universal or Catholic. War would ravage China for another 100 years until the 10th century. During this time, the Mongols were forced west by 2 of their vassals breaking away from the Zofstanal Church, these being Urad and Gaizhou. They would join the rest of the Chinese kingdoms in pledging their allegiance to the Gaofu, or High Father, of the Yuzhou Church. This fostered a high degree of unity amongst the kingdoms of China, meaning that the Gaofu had immense power over all of them. In the 11th century, Gao Fu Heng declared a holy war upon the islands of Japan, which had since closed themselves off completely from the chaos of the mainland. With his many ships full of faithful willing to die for the kingdom of heaven, they would die indeed, as 2 mighty storms sank each invasion fleet. Such a poor omen caused many of the kingdoms of China to shift their focus and turn inwards. While they maintained their faith and loyalty to the Gaofu, they began focusing on their own affairs, forging alliances with and going to war against one another at whichever time seemed prudent to their kings. The Gaofu was a participant in this game as well, consecrating royal marriages, serving letters of excommunication, and even proclaiming certain wars as righteous in order to grow the power and influence of the Uzhou Church. Meanwhile, Japan, unified under the Kozuke shogunate, would remain unperturbed for a great many centuries. Beginning in the latter half of the 11th century, various learned clergy pontificated on the philosophy of God and what the world he made is for. These thoughts crystallized with the arrival of the great philosopher Hua Shenong, who concluded through great prayer, study, and meditation that the best way to get closer to understanding God is to understand the world he made. If God created the world, then his reflection can be found in it like a potter's mark, and the more we know about it, the closer believers draw to him. This philosophical movement, known as Taoyi Shijie, or the World of Pottery School of Thought, spread like wildfire throughout the Chinese kingdoms, and was eagerly adopted by the rulers of the age. Indeed, embracing this philosophy enabled them to gain a potential edge on their political rivals. From the 11th to the 15th centuries, technological advancement exploded, and in this crucible of cutthroat competition, innovation thrived and was rewarded pound for pound with the blood of your enemies. Such inventions included the printing press, the heavy plow, mechanical clocks, the blast furnace, vision-correcting eyeglasses, multi-sail rigged ships of a variety of classes, varying in size but all capable of sustained deep-sea travel, and perhaps most significantly, gunpowder, and all of its most devastating derivatives, namely cannons, which they mounted on their hulking vessels. Indeed, the East had discovered the limitless value of the ocean during this age, resulting in grand naval battles taking place, but also vast, far-reaching exploration, mapping out much of Southeast Asia, and even discovering the northern coast of Australia. One such kingdom took things a step further, and sought to reconnect with the distant West, to which the Mongols had denied them access for centuries now. So, in 1449, King Fuxi of Poyang commissioned 3 huge ships to forge across the seas and gather for him knowledge of the world which could bring him closer to God, as well as, of course, rare treasures from beyond the waves. Admiral Long Wei Chen was put up to the task, and set out with his 3 ships, Shangyi, Shangar, and Shangsan, meaning sacred, 1, 2, and 3. Admiral Long Wei charted his course down along the coast of Nam Ning, narrowly avoiding an incident with some locals out further than they should have been. They charted through the Strait of Malacca, bewildering the locals with their wealth and splendor. The fleet gave a wide berth to Rajasthan, spurning all interaction with the heretics of the subcontinent, as was official state doctrine in Poyang. Soon they stopped in eastern Africa and traded with the Aljuran, who had grown wealthy from trade with both Phrygia and Rajasthan. As they departed, they sailed east of Madagascar and hit a squall due south of it, which sank the Shangar. They rounded the south of Africa, only barely, as they lost yet another ship, the Shangsan. Alone and battered by the seas, the Shangyi and her captain sailed up the western coast of Africa, being peppered with arrows as they passed Toro, and arriving off the coast of Avarignia, where they were met by a clutch of bewildered fishermen who made for shore in a scrambling panic. As the great prow of the Shangyi slowly came to a stop, its great portrait of Shugauja cracked and peeling, 3 lonely rowboats landed on the soft sands of Aviero Beach, where Avarignia touches the sea, and Long Wei, the great explorer of his age, knelt down and planted a small gem of jade in the sand, as thanks to this new land and penance for all he would take from it.